bitter cold, I think it counts as bitter cold, to come with us tonight to be here at the first of the History Institute series. We have a combination. I think we have some members of the public, some people who are interested in Professor Wilson's talk, which is wonderful. Welcome to you. And we also have some teachers who are staying after the talk for a workshop on using primary sources. So welcome to everyone. My name is Suzanne Judson-Whitehouse. I'm the Assistant Director of Emerging America, a program here at the Professional Development Department at the Collaborative. My colleague Rich Cairn is standing over here. I see familiar faces and new faces, which is a really nice mix. So take a minute also to, we'll be seeing later Teresa Bruckerhoff, who is our program evaluator. She'll be coming in at the end of the teacher portion of the workshops, or right at the very end to do an evaluation, but she'll be here soon. Also want to introduce Jessica Johnson, who is from the UMass History Department. She's the outreach coordinator, and UMass is our partner in the History Institutes. We're very pleased to work with Jessica and the faculty at UMass. So I want to introduce Professor Mary Wilson. She is from the Department of History at UMass. She's a scholar of the Middle East, and in addition to her publications on the Middle East, she also has traveled extensively throughout the region, and we're very pleased to have you with us here tonight.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here, which you wouldn't know from my late arrival. But I really do apologize, because I know that many of you are coming from a long day at work, whereas I'm coming from a long day at my computer constructing this talk. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about me, or me and the Middle East, I first went to the Middle East as a junior year abroad student from Oberlin College, and I went to the American University of Beirut. And this was, I'm sorry to say, 1970. Yay! Age mate. From that time, from that experience, I knew when I got back home in 1971 that I wanted to do something with the Middle East. Went back to college, graduated as a senior, early 70s, terrible job market, maybe as bad as right now. And so I went to Cairo to teach English as a foreign language in Cairo, and I lived in Cairo for a year. And all this time I'm thinking about, oh, graduate school, do I have the patience, do I have the resources? I had been learning some Arabic, but boy, really rudimentary. Am I going to be able to learn Arabic? Well, after the year in Cairo, I spent a few more years working and traveling, and then 4 years after I graduated from college, I got up my courage and applied to graduate school. And I went to Oxford University and got my degree in what they used to call Oriental Studies, which is a very old-fashioned name, I'm sure you all know, so I won't belabor that point at all. Since that time, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East doing research, and more recently, just being there, because I think it's really important when I'm teaching the subject to have a feel for it and to have that enthusiasm that I get by being there. So most recently I spent a year teaching at the American University of Beirut. That was in 2005-2006. And then in spring 2011, I taught for a semester at the American University of Sharjah, which is in the United Arab Emirates. And that, I'm sorry to say, is the last time I've been to the Middle East. I would go there at any time, to any place I could get to. I was in Lebanon during the Civil War. And as people say, when you are, violence is terrible, killing is terrible. The numbers of dead, maybe some 100,000 in Syria by this time, is horrific. But when you live in a place that is going through these armed struggles, you very readily learn to adapt. And you get food, you store water, you store food, and you go out when you deem it safe. So life goes on. Life ends, but life goes on. So let's talk about the Middle East. I'm going to start with the broader picture of the Middle East, and then I'm going to narrow it down to Syria. Absolutely, it's a very Eurocentric term, and it's an artifact of history. The British were, the sun never set on the British Empire, and the British named portions of the globe according to their interests. Ironically, it was an American who first used the term Middle East in relationship to what we today conventionally consider to be the Middle East. So, for your students, it would be fun to ask, for my students, it's fun to ask, okay, so if you were Chinese, how would you describe the Middle East? And this isn't a good map to show that, but if you show a map where the Pacific is in the center, then the Middle East is the Middle West. Exactly. So those kinds of things are fun for kids to reimagine the globe from the conventional Eurocentric globe picture that we have. The more interesting question for me is middle of what? So I can give you the first answer that occurred to me. Again, if I can move this forward. Okay. It's in the middle of the trade routes of the so-called Old World. Can you see this okay? Should the lights be dimmed?
Yes.
Can the lights be dimmed?
Is that?
Oh, that's much better.
Good.
Yeah, that's much better. Okay, so you can see that almost all of the trade routes of the Old World go through the Middle East. The Middle East connected East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Africa, to Europe. And Europe was, of all those places, by far the least important trading place to the other parts of this world trade pattern. Another thing I like to think about is if you accept the current notion of where humans came from based on the study of mitochondrial DNA, humans came from Africa. And so all humans, or most humans, had to go through the Middle East to get to where we live today. That's how important the middleness of the Middle East is. Now, is there an alternative to Middle East? What do your textbooks use to describe the region?
West Asia.
West Asia, okay. Anything else? No Southwest Asias? Southwest Asia. Okay, so what are the advantages of West Asia or Southwest Asia?
Not being Eurocentric.
Okay, not being Eurocentric. Any other advantages? Yes.
The term Middle East carries a lot of baggage with it besides geographic,
Yes?
and Southwest Asia seems more just geographic.
Okay, so baggage. What baggage? What images come to your mind when the term Middle East is used?
Colonialism.
Colonialism.
Upheaval.
What?
Upheaval.
Upheaval, absolutely. What else?
Poverty.
Poverty,
Arabs.
Arabs,
Terrorists.
what?
Terrorists.
Yes.
In middle school life.
Yeah, absolutely. How about women
Oh,
wearing
yeah.
veils? How about a religion different from the religion that many Americans practice? All of those things. Camels?
Oil.
Oil. Okay, all of those things come with the term Middle East. And I agree, that's a negative. The positive for me about the Middle East, and that's because I'm as old as I am and because I was brought up and trained using the term Middle East, the positive about the term is that it brings, to me anyway, an actual feeling of people, of cultures. Southwest Asia, I gotta think, you know, where is that, first of all? It doesn't, for me, carry the automatic sense of cultures, of peoples. Or West Asia, you know, that's huge. Where does the Middle East fit into West Asia? So, you know, Middle East has pluses and minuses. I have no doubt that the kids you're teaching today, if they're brought up using the term Southwest Asia or West Asia, will develop those immediate cultural ideas related to the term, for good and for bad. The immediate stereotypes, for good and for bad. But right now, you know, the media doesn't use those terms, and we get most of our ideas, at least we grown-ups and even kids these days, from the media. So I don't know how soon human cultural characteristics will immediately come to mind when the term Middle East is used. Okay. So, trade routes of the old world, so-called. How did 1492 change that?
Head west.
They found
Okay.
they found a new India.
Okay, a new India.
Well, the Ottomans were extracting very high tariffs for Western Europe to trade with Asia, so they looked for alternative routes, one around Africa. Then Columbus figured out, well, I'll go west and bump into Cathay anyways.
Okay, all right. This is a very simplified map of new trade routes. Trade routes, world trade routes, continue to go through the Middle East. So this makes it seem as if the Middle East is no longer important to world trade at all. It was, and in particular it was up until about 1750, you know, middle of the 18th century, even 1800. Why? Because ships had not yet developed the speed and the capacity for cargo that they were to develop, and therefore trade by ship was not so, it didn't, you know, 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. 1493, suddenly ships are plying these new trade routes, or Vasco da Gama goes around Africa, suddenly everybody's going around Africa. No, it took centuries for these sea routes and ships to develop so that they could handle the trade that used to come through the Middle East. So let me give you two examples of what 1492, the impact of 1492 and after on the Middle East by talking about two products. First product I want to talk about is the coffee trade. Coffee was not a popular beverage in Europe, even in the Middle East, until the 15th, 16th century, okay, quite late. All the coffee in the world came from, at that time, Ethiopia and Yemen. And therefore it used the trade routes going up through Arabia to the Mediterranean, or it used a land trade route to the Nile and went down the Nile to the Mediterranean. Now, coffee drinking spread rapidly in the Middle East. It was the most popular beverage certainly by 1600. And it created with it a new social and political life in the Middle East. Cafes became the centers of people, men, meeting, talking politics. And therefore, cafes were periodically deemed illegal by the Ottoman Sultan, who tried to close them down from time to time, never successfully. It's important to remember that early modern states, like the Ottoman Empire, like any of the European states, did not have fast communication. So you could decree something in Istanbul, you could send the decree to Damascus, but who's going to enforce it? Who's going to maintain that enforcement? In any case, coffee was so popular, could not be held down, and cafes became and remained a staple of Middle Eastern social life. Men hung out in cafes. Women also drank coffee. They drank it together at bathhouses on the days that the bathhouses were open for women, and they drank it together in their homes where they entertained other women. So both for men and women, coffee served this incredible function in increasing sociability. However, we were talking about 1492. So coffee drinking spread from Istanbul into Europe. Europeans wanted to take over the coffee trade. Coffee traders in the Middle East were earning fortunes, especially those in Cairo. And there remain in Cairo these huge mansions of coffee traders that you can visit until today. Europeans wanted to get control of the coffee trade, and so legend has it that a Dutch merchant went to Yemen or Ethiopia and stole a coffee bush. And where did he take it? He took it to Indonesia, to Java. That's why we call coffee Java. Indonesia, Java became one of the big producers of coffee, and the traders who plied the Atlantic took it to the Caribbean, and eventually Mexico, and eventually areas of South America, such that by the 19th century, most of the coffee drunk in the Middle East didn't come from the Middle East. So one way that 1492 affected Middle Eastern trade was by displacing products from the Middle East to other parts of the world where they were grown cheaply, thank you to slave labor, and where they could be sold and undercut the price of Middle East coffee. Another product that is similar to coffee was the sugar trade. Sugar trade existed in the Middle East in the warmest and wettest parts of the Middle East, namely the Jordan Valley, from antiquity. When Muslims conquered the Middle East, they brought products from their larger empire. And from the larger Islamic empires, they imported cotton seeds from Turkestan. And those seeds were a different kind of cotton. They could grow in dry areas. They didn't need that hothouse of the Jordan Valley, at which point cotton growing spread throughout. I'm sorry, I'm talking about cotton?
Yeah.
I meant to be talking about sugar. Well, let's go on with cotton. At which point cotton spread throughout the Middle East. Cotton was also a huge product in India, and cotton became a huge product in the American South. During the American Civil War, you all know this, you probably teach your classes this. During the American Civil War, South was cut off, and Egypt, the primary cotton growing area in the Middle East, absolutely took off. And it started to produce more and more cotton. And two things happened on account of that, or maybe three things. First of all, from the Nile River, irrigation spread in the Nile Delta. And to spread irrigation, the Nile had to be controlled. So barriers were built that would hold back the annual flood. The result of this on Egypt was that Egyptian ground that was fed by irrigation became saturated. And by virtue of being saturated, it slowly started to become salinated. The salt content grew. So the soil itself became less and less fertile. The other thing was that in saturated soils lives a snail that carries bilharzia. Bilharzia is a disease that enters the human body through the soles of the feet. Well, maybe other places if you stood with your hands in watery soil for a very long time. But peasants, bare feet, they're walking in this wet land. The land never dries out because it is permanently irrigated. When you have a wet, dry cycle, the snails that carry bilharzia die out. But when it's permanently wet, bilharzia became endemic to Egypt. And what bilharzia causes is not immediate death. It may be 20 years, maybe even 30 years, but it absolutely debilitates the body and drains you of energy. So, the British were fond of saying of the Egyptians, and frankly of all natives that were part of the British Empire, that they were lazy. Well, if Egyptians were lazy, it was in part to this disease that had been fostered by the spread of cotton growing. Cotton growing spread because the British mills in Manchester needed it to supply enough raw material to produce more cheap cloth. The short story about sugar is that sugar was grown in the Levant area, in what is today Lebanon, let's say, and it gradually spread westwards. It spread westwards to the islands of the Mediterranean, and then with 1492, sugar was taken to the so-called New World, such that the New World took over the sugar growing and sugar market. Again, helped very much by slave labor. Okay, so that's 1492 and after. Comments, questions? Yes?
Asia. One thing about West Asia is that it locates it in Asia. To what extent does that have any meaning?
To the same extent that the term Middle East has meaning. I mean, the continents are arbitrary, extremely arbitrary. Their names are arbitrary. What connotations does Asia carry in mind? So what meaning does West Asia have? Right, a geographical meaning if you accept the continental theory of geography. So it's in the western part of this great big hunk of territory that stops at an undefined area, sort of in, here. It's a very good question. All of the, the continents, all of the regions that we normally talk about, they're aids. We have to talk about these regions, we have to give them a name, I suppose. We can't talk about them, town by town, person by person, even city by city, when you're trying to teach world history, let's say. So we have these collective names that are more or less useful. Best you can do is get your students to discuss that concept.
It's just all Eurocentric. I mean, I don't know what, haven't studied Chinese ancient history, so I don't know what their society called their area. But we, the Europeans, white Europeans, named everything.
Right.
So that's what we see.
Well, we named everything and the name stuck.
That's
Because
because,
we grew, yeah,
because of
exactly.
colonialism.
absolutely, yeah, because of our economic power, and
Right.
frankly, our economic power was
Repression.
fully supported by arms, gunboat diplomacy. Okay. Next picture. So, let's say we use the term Middle East. What is it? What does it comprise? And, you know, this search took me about 2 minutes. I thought it would take me a long time. So, you know, here are two different pictures of what the Middle East supposedly is. On the left, this is the Wikipedia map, forgive me for using Wikipedia, for AP history. On the right is a map labeled Middle Eastern countries from the Geodata catalog. The Geodata catalog is fascinating. I didn't have a lot of time to explore it, but if you click on any of these countries' names, you get information about the countries, which is, you know, really useful, especially for me if I'm about to go into a class and teach about these countries and I've forgotten the current population.
The CIA website have that?
Oh, CIA website definitely does have that. Problem with the CIA website is you have to go to each country.
Right.
So if you're looking for some kind of aggregate comparative numbers, it's a pain
So,
to use.
would you name that website again?
Geodata. One word, capital G-E-O, capital D-A-T-A. No comma, no nothing. One word. Okay, so why? The map on the left is the Middle East that I was talking about. Map on the right is a more recent rendition of what is the Middle East. Why is it changing?
We're looking at a broader picture
Yes?
more than anything else. All the other stands, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, they were all part of the Middle East, so to speak, because they were all culturally somewhat together, but they were sort of subsumed under the Soviet Union, and we sort of thought of them as the old Soviet Union, I think. My readings of it.
Okay, that's a very good reason. Why else? I mean, Pakistan, Afghanistan, I don't know a thing about Pakistan and Afghanistan, or at least I didn't learn anything about them as a graduate student. Now that's what my students want to know about. So I gotta do some quick reading up. Pakistan and Afghanistan were always there. Why suddenly are they part of the Middle East, do you think? Yeah.
The Bush foreign policy of Middle East exceptionalism.
Oh, okay. The second article. Excellent. I'm so glad. All right, Middle East exceptionalism.
Well, plus after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of those countries grouped together because they had similar interests and similar desires to blend, to get more international and to break away from the Soviet Union. And they felt more culturally connected to Iran and Iraq and Turkey because a lot of them were mostly Muslim.
Okay. All right.
I would say that there's some geopolitics involved in this.
Explain.
That we became very interested in the minerals that they harbored and
Okay.
the way we can, I just remember back in the 70s knowing someone who went to Iran from AT&T, and he was doing work for the CIA there, setting up listening posts. So it's a great way to listen in on other people for one thing, but also projecting power within the region.
All right. But, you know, don't we try to project power even further east, across North Africa? North Africa part of the Middle East, it's certainly majority Muslim.
Well, the map on the left is more what the partition after the First and Second World War of divvying up the European colonies,
Absolutely.
colonial issues,
Yes.
and deciding, okay, now they can run themselves, sort of.
Okay.
But, you know, making arbitrary lines with no consideration for cultural or
Absolutely.
ideology.
Absolutely.
Western-
And the lines on the map on the right, are they more rational? Are they any less arbitrary?
They're still arbitrary. They're still very
Okay.
arbitrary.
It's the same as what the Europeans did to Africa.
Mhm.
They cut it up the way they wanted it.
Mhm.
Okay, all right. So, you know, you choose. What do you want to teach in your classes about the Middle East? For me, smaller works better, but, you know, it's, again, it's something that you can discuss with your students. Shake up their preconceived notions. You don't need me to tell you that. Yes?
Is part of the reason why the term emerged when it did, I have assumed that it's partly that it was the decline of the Ottoman Empire, that before the Ottoman Empire fell apart, most Europeans, most people in the world probably would have thought, well, that's the Ottoman Empire. It's a good chunk of that territory, the eastern part of it.
That's true enough, and Europe called the Ottoman Empire Turkey. If you see any maps, any European maps, I don't know about any, but European maps in newspapers from the 19th century have, you know, this huge area called Turkey, which is basically the state of Turkey today and the Fertile Crescent. So they didn't differentiate anything.
If you're not looking at this from a Eurocentric point of view, and you were an individual, a citizen of one of these countries, what map or perspective would be the preference from a non-Eurocentric point of view? Or what identity, or do folks even look at their own boundaries this way?
Well, I can only speak for Arabic speakers, because that's the Middle East language I know. And they refer to the area that they come from as Sharq al-Awsat, the Middle East.
Okay.
So these names are imposed and then
Assimilated.
embraced, assimilated. Yeah, maybe not embraced, but certainly assimilated.
Where would they figure the borders are?
Oh,
Varies from person to person.
good question. I don't know about person to person, but I would think that in the Middle East, the small map would be considered the Middle East.
I know from the few Pakistanis that I know, they try to differentiate themselves from the more radicals. They're Pakistanis.
Oh, yeah,
They're very much Pakistanis.
yes. Okay, so in your curriculums, I am imagining that you cover the Roman Empire. And that the Middle East, well, you tell me, in your curriculums, what of the Middle East is included and how much? And I can tell you what I got in my K-12 education. But things have changed, yeah.
Well, I teach IB history, and we're doing 20th century and with concentration in Europe and the Middle East. So I teach a lot. We have a whole trimester on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then we do World War I and the aftermath in the Middle East, and a case study in Iran.
That is so amazing to me. That's great. I am really happy to hear it. Yes?
Sixth grade, ancient Civ, I teach Mesopotamia,
Yep,
and that covers that.
yep, absolutely. No ancient Egypt?
Yes, ancient Egypt and Alexander the Great when we get into ancient Greece.
Oh, go Alexander. All right. I mean, that's certainly how I was taught about the Middle East. Ancient Egyptians, the Fertile Crescent, the Roman Empire, ancient Greece. Okay, that was all that was all that I got of the Middle East. And of course, at the time, the Roman Empire and ancient Greece were conceived of as totally unattached from the southern and eastern Mediterranean. Which is a problem. So if you look at this map of the 1st century of Islam and the spread of the Muslim faith, not that everyone in this area converted to Islam or converted quickly to Islam, but the spread of Muslim rule was very fast. And as you can see, remembering from the map of the Roman Empire, the direct heirs of the Roman Empire is the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. I certainly didn't learn that in grade school or beyond. Now, what is important about this map is to consider the rapidity of the creation of the first Arab Islamic empire, called the Umayyad Empire, whose capital was, by the way, Damascus. Damascus is roughly down there. So we're talking about Syria today, Syria being in the middle. Syria is smack dab in the middle of this spreading Islamic empire. The spread of Islam was really fast, and something fast like that, at least in the telling of it, demands drama. And so the picture that certainly I was brought up with, and the picture that I think is still prevalent in the United States today, is a picture of robed warriors on horses or camels, wielding scimitars, grabbing someone by the hair and saying, "Convert or die." It wasn't like that. In fact, Muslims were not eager to convert, certainly not in the 1st century, because they could impose higher taxes on non-Muslims. Muslims were perfectly happy to have non-Muslims under their rule. This sort of central heartland of Islam, from Spain and Morocco, east of Iran to Pakistan, what is today Pakistan and Afghanistan, for these regions to become majority Muslim took like 4 centuries. It was a very long process. Similarly, the spread of the Arabic language was a bit faster, certainly in the Fertile Crescent. We'll get my arrow under control here. The Fertile Crescent here, the 5 states today of Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon. Those states gradually adopted Arabic from Aramaic. The 2 languages are closely related, so that relatively fast adoption makes perfect sense. Iran maintained its own language, Farsi or Persian. Why? Well, it wasn't related to Arabic, so the transition was not going to be an easy one. And it had a long tradition of literature in Farsi that gave the language a prestige, a memorized corpus of works, and Iran to this day is not Arabic speaking. There is an Arabic speaking minority in Iran, and you know, it's just not going to become Arabic speaking. In Spain and Portugal, Arabic was very important, probably not the language of the majority. Spain was, or parts of Spain were ruled by Muslims from 750 until 1492, that famous date. In 1492, another thing that happened to the Middle East is that the very Christian monarchy of Ferdinand and Isabella exiled, exported Jews and Muslims, and almost all of them went to North Africa, and some of them continued on settling in the Fertile Crescent, including in Syria, settling in Istanbul, and most importantly, settling in Salonika, which until the 20th century was a majority Jewish city. Okay, now, Muslims. There are a lot of Muslims in the world, and by no means do the majority of Muslims live in the Middle East. So in the world there are some 1.57 billion Muslims, or as the article says, 1 in 4 people are Muslims. That strikes me as a newspaper trying to get attention by using scare tactics. Oh my God. But they do admit that there are more Christians in the world than Muslims, but they don't give us that ratio. 2 out of every 4 people, or 2 out of every 5 people are Christians. So to say that the Middle East is somehow defined by Islam is problematic. You can't see the map really clearly from where you are, but the most populous Muslim nation, or nation with Muslim citizens, is Indonesia. Nowhere near the Middle East. Okay, this article fascinated me. It's from the Daily Mail, a kind of middle to lowbrow London newspaper. And so they're talking about Muslims, and this article has 2 pictures. This picture and this picture. And under this picture it says, and 1.6 million Muslims live in Britain. Oh my God. Okay, so what is this picture? Is it staged?
Stereotyping.
What?
Stereotyping.
Oh, it's certainly stereotyping. Is it staged? Is it of, or is it of real women? Where do you think it was taken?
A school.
Looks like,
Looks like schoolgirls.
looks like
Schoolgirls wearing their uniforms.
Yeah,
Okay,
that would be my guess.
all right.
Rather conservative area, maybe.
A rather conservative area. Where's the most conservative area?
Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely. My guess
So
is that
Riyadh.
this is a picture of Saudi Arabia. So now, Westerners look at this picture and say, oh my God, you know, oh, women are so repressed, and the place is so traditional. Well, let me show you some pictures of some traditional Saudi women's clothing. Ta-da! Surprise, surprise! Beautiful colors. The one on the left, yes, she's wearing a face veil. The one on the right, the one on the left is from Nejd. Nejd is the central region of Saudi Arabia where the Wahhabis come from and where the Saud family comes from. And it was the alliance between the Sauds and the Wahhabi leader and founder that enabled the Saud family to conquer most of Arabia, not all of it. So Najd, you can see, wonderful colors, but pretty conservative in terms of covering up the female form. The picture on the right is a picture of a local dress. This dress was probably not widespread in the Hejaz. What's the Hejaz famous for? The Hejaz is on the left-hand coast of Saudi Arabia, Red Sea. Where are the Muslim holy cities?
Mecca.
Mecca and Medina. Okay, they are in the Hejaz. The explanation for this costume is not that, I mean, you would expect the Muslim holy places, my gosh, if Muslims are so conservative, those women would be really covered up. But no, the Hejaz, since Muslims, pious Muslims in any case, make the pilgrimage to Mecca at a certain time of year. They gather in Mecca from all over the world, and some of them stay on in Mecca because it's a holy thing to do, because it's a good thing to do. Practices from all over the world, clothing practices, fed into the clothing traditions of the Hejaz and made the clothing unbelievably interesting. Who knew? It's only in the 20th century that women in Saudi Arabia became a state in 1935, started wearing this horrible, drab, all black gear. We think of it as traditional. For them, it's modern. Sorry to say.
Well, didn't Muhammad, at one point in his writings early on, rail against the scanty clothing of some of the women in Mecca or Medina, I forget which? I thought I read somewhere that he wanted his women to be a little less provocatively dressed.
Not so much, yes.
My understanding is that both men and women should dress modestly, but not necessarily
Covering up, yeah.
I mean,
But I think I remember reading something when I took a Middle Eastern history class. I remember the professor saying that he was complaining that some of the very wealthy women were showing off with very wealthy, very extravagant clothing that made other people look more impoverished. And I think that was what he was more concerned about, of differentiation of wealth too.
Well, certainly the Prophet was concerned with the poor, and would have found that displays of wealth totally repugnant. So I can certainly believe that.
Why the change?
Why the change?
From this to the all black?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't really have an answer. I have suppositions. But why? Why the change?
Was it all at once, or was it over a period of time?
You know, unfortunately, we don't know that much about dress. I was lucky to find a book on Saudi costume, and it had these lovely pictures in it. But we don't know that much about change over time. I do know that at least in modern history, when Saudi Arabia does something that we would consider modern, like adopting television, or does something as it did do after Iraq invaded Kuwait and the United States sent troops, not just to Iraq, but stationed troops in Saudi Arabia, that in order to balance that sort of change in policy, which many Saudis would regard with total horror. In order to balance that, the restrictions on women became tighter. So what restrictions on women? Why would dress change? Maybe it's related to imperialism, to the arrival of Westerners in the Middle East. Maybe it's related to the creation of states and a state identity, and therefore trying to impose some sort of state-identified costume. You had your hand up. Yeah. No? Oh, don't stretch. I'll call it. Yeah.
When does Wahhabism, which seems to be very orthodox, start taking control of the centers of power, so that you get this thing of, you know, women are the enticers and make men fall, therefore you clothe them. So, I mean, you mentioned the Wahhabi tribe and...
It's not a tribe, it's an interpretation of the Quran, Wahhabism.
What were the two tribes, the Saudis and who came together to...
Saudis are a big family. They came together with the
I thought you said Wahhab.
well, his last name was Wahhab,
Okay, but
from
not
which we
Wahhabi.
get the word Wahhabi.
Right,
Yeah.
so, correct me, I thought Wahhabism started taking hold in the mid to late 19th century.
Well, so first of all, Islam, like any scripturally based religion, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is subject to interpretation of the scriptures. So Wahhabism is I wouldn't call it an orthodox interpretation.
All right.
And many
A
Muslims don't.
conservative interpretation?
Extremely conservative. To the utter extremely conservative. And most Muslims outside of Saudi Arabia really have a horror of it. And given current world politics, are quick to point out that they're not Wahhabis and they regard it as
Is the Saud family
Not good.
Wahhabi, or are they,
they're Wahhabi.
they're Wahhabi?
Yeah, it's an interpretation.
Yeah.
And you what Wahhabism is, basically Arabia was the least orthodox of all Islamic places, because Islam is best practiced and properly practiced in cities, where you have mosques, where you have law courts, where you have educated people to interpret the scriptures and interpret the laws. And there were no cities outside of Mecca and Medina in Arabia. And so Arabia was extremely unorthodox and unobservant. When this thinker in Arabia in the 18th century, middle 18th century, developed his thought, it was attractive for one big reason. It was simple. You didn't have to read, you didn't have to interpret, you just had to follow the outward signs of the faith. You had to pray 5 times a day, you had to dress however Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab interpreted women and men should dress. You had to fast during Ramadan, you had to give alms to the poor, okay? And those prescriptions were enforced, and they are enforced by the state in Saudi Arabia today. They're not enforced anywhere else in the Middle Eastern Muslim states, at least to my knowledge. But they are enforced in Saudi Arabia. Did I answer your question?
Pretty much.
Okay. I get lost where I am.
That's all right.
Can I ask you
Yes.
a quick question about
Absolutely.
some of the women that are trying to bump up against all the strictures? They've had those driving protests.
Yes.
And the movie that's I think it's at the Sundance Film Festival, that was filmed by a Muslim woman in Saudi Arabia about a young girl that wants a bicycle.
Wajda?
Yeah.
Wajda. I advise or recommend that movie to all of you. It's a fantastic movie.
I definitely want to see it,
Yeah.
but what, do you think that they are going to have any impact on the Saudi way of running and, you know, they've been railing for the vote for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, trying to get women to be able to get the vote. Women did get the vote, but it's like they don't really get that much to do with it.
Well, they
Doesn't
get to
really help.
vote in municipal
Municipal elections, yeah.
I mean, you know, who gets to vote in Saudi Arabia? The king is the king. He's not voted in. So voting in Saudi Arabia is a minimal activity for everybody. Will voting come in Saudi Arabia? Will Saudi Arabia suddenly become a democracy? I would not bet the farm.
No.
Ever.
It's just that the members of the ruling family are in their 80s.
Well, they've got sons.
A lot of sons.
Yeah, a lot of sons. But a lot of their sons, the next ones in line, are up there in years too.
Grandsons, even more grandsons. Problem for Saudi Arabia is the huge size of the royal family and whether they will start bickering amongst themselves once this first generation of sons of Abdulaziz dies off.
All kinds of Shakespearean conflicts abound.
Haven't they already sort of started arguing, fighting amongst themselves anyway?
There have been, but you know, we get very little news out of Saudi Arabia. It's very tightly controlled. I should start to talk about Syria. So Roman Syria is not the Syrian state that we know it today. It's a very much larger area, basically the whole Eastern Mediterranean, comprising the states that we know today of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. And Arabs called Syria Sham, Bilad al-Sham, the country of El-Sham. El-Sham means on the left-hand side. So they were standing facing east in Arabia, and on the left-hand side was El-Sham. El-Sham was known to Arabs of the peninsula as a place where pastures are fertile, rains pour forth, trees are abundant, rivers flow, and revenue is plentiful. It is host to the dwelling places of the prophets and Jerusalem the elect. That's a description from al-Masudi, who is a 10th century Arab geographer. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting my slides up. Oh, sorry. I don't know why that is. So we have that one. I want to go on to the next one, and I can't figure out how. So rather than take more time looking for pictures, oh wait.
Will the arrow keys work?
Excuse me?
Will the arrow keys work?
The arrow keys, I forgot all about them. No. No, I don't know why they're not working. Let's talk about Syria, the state, as we know it today, in its present boundaries. So that came into existence after the First World War. The Ottoman Empire was on the losing side in the First World War, and part of the punishment was that it would have its territory divided up and doled out amongst the European states. So France received the mandate of Lebanon and Syria. Britain received the mandate of Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. The state of Syria that the French ruled is not quite exactly the state of Syria that we know today. In the upper northwest corner up here, in 1939, the French gave this swath of territory to Turkey. It was, Turks had long, had ever since the creation of the Turkish state after the First World War in 1922, had cast covetous eyes over northern Syria. Why? It was part of the trading sphere of Anatolia, and very important to Turkish trade. This region was claimed by Turkey, and France gave it to them. One reason was because France, the Allies, wanted to make sure that Turkey remained neutral during the war, the coming Second World War. So Syria lost territory. The other part of Syria that is no longer Syria is the Golan, that was occupied by Israel in 1967, and in 1981 it was annexed by Israel. So Syria has already had chunks taken out of it by neighboring states. In the present conflict, you can be sure that neighboring states and farther away states have been extremely involved.
Was Lebanon carved out of Greater Syria?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so they also lost the Lebanon area, besides
Well,
the Turks and Golan Heights.
Well, if you're talking about Greater Syria, Palestine was carved out, Jordan was
Okay.
carved out, Lebanon was carved out. Yeah, it was just divided up, you know, to suit the interests of Britain and France. Okay, so Syria has, you know, had little dents taken out of it from time to time. What are the interests of the surrounding states in Syria? What are the surrounding states? If I could bring up a map, this would not be a problem.
Turkey, Iraq,
Yes?
Israel,
Yes?
Lebanon,
Yes?
former Soviet Union states up north in Iran.
Not directly bordering on Syria, but around. Yeah, that'd be great. Oh, yeah, absolutely. What else? Jordan. Jordan to the south.
would you count Cyprus?
Would I count Cyprus? Well, I wouldn't call it, oh, wonderful, thank you. How'd you do that? Okay, keep going, back. Okay, that's good. Okay. Now, how do I get it forward? Oh, yeah, all right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, hooray! Ottoman Empire, end of the First World War, and the modern state, the modern political map of the Middle East. It's a lousy political map. Let me show you what has been chopped off. You know what? Where's my bag? Over here. I have a pointer that I can control a little bit better. Okay, so that pink bit is what was given to Turkey in 1939, and the Golan Heights is right there, which Israel invaded and occupied in 1967. These were the original mandates. Unfortunately, this map is not correct because this chunk has already been taken out, but Syria once extended. This includes the important port city of Antioch, which is one of the reasons why it was a very sore point with Syrians for many years. Syrians and Turks have had Syria and Turkey have had terrible relations for quite a long time, up until basically the present. However, now Turkey is very involved with the civil war. This is an extremely porous border, and for reasons that I frankly don't understand, Turkey is allowing fighters, mainly jihadi fighters, Islamist fighters, they fly to Turkey and then they cross this very porous border. I think today Turkey announced that it was going to close this border. But how successful they'll be is anyone's guess. This is extremely mountainous, hard border to police. So Turkey, Islamist fighters come through Turkey and infiltrate Syria. From Jordan, you also get a trickle of Islamist fighters. From Iraq, you get a trickle of, or more than a trickle of fighters supporting the regime. And Iran, on the other side of Iraq, is supporting the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad by allowing the Lebanese party Hezbollah, the militias of Hezbollah, to fight in Syria, and Iran is also arming them. So those countries are interested in the outcome. Who else is interested in the outcome?
United States.
United States. What does the United States want to happen?
Assad to fall.
Okay.
Ostensibly, that's what's said.
Okay, increasingly, the Civil War broke out in 2011, March 2011. The U.S. at first said nothing for quite a long time, and then started leaning to the opposition. Ostensibly, because the opposition would bring democracy to Syria. However, as the opposition began to be dominated by right-wing Sunni Islamist armed groups, the United States has drawn back somewhat.
You really think so?
Well, I don't
You
know.
don't think there are black operations going on in there?
Well,
Men
the black
supporting,
operations certainly.
You know, McCain's putting his arms around these people.
I
You know,
suppose.
One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and all that.
On Wednesday, the United States and Britain both announced that they were going to stop the sending of non-lethal aid to Syria.
So they send it through Saudi Arabia.
Now, what is non-lethal aid?
Food and medicine.
Thankfully, no. They have designated that as humanitarian aid.
Okay.
Non-lethal aid is all of those
Trucks.
trucks,
Body armor.
vests, body armor,
Okay.
GPSs,
Night vision.
all that kind of stuff. So that has ostensibly stopped. And I say ostensibly because we really don't know. The U.S.'s good ally, Saudi Arabia, is certainly funding Islamist opposition in Syria. So is Kuwait, or Kuwaiti individuals, not the state itself. So is the UAE. There are huge foundations that have been created in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf states, for the support of the Islamist fighters. And they've collected huge amounts of money from individuals. Similarly, there are Shia organizations in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, that also have formed groups to fund the government. Now, yes?
To say the Shia population of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states is pretty well controlled. So how much could they actually be funding?
Well,
Compared to the Saudis, which is the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the intimation that Kuwait as a country is not supporting, but Kuwait's a family too.
that's absolutely true, but I've seen the figures from Kuwait, and they are huge. So,
No, I believe that.
yeah.
But I'm
Yeah.
saying, by saying Saudi Arabia as a country is supporting, but Kuwaiti individuals are supporting.
Mhm.
But Kuwait is a family. I mean,
Right.
there was no Kuwait originally.
Right. Well, there were none
There's
of
no
these
Saudi
states
Arabia
originally. There was no
empire
United
either.
States originally either.
Right.
Okay. All right, so Syria's religious groups. Why do we in the West see the Syrian civil war in terms of religion? In terms of Alawites, who are ostensibly Shia, versus Sunni? Why do we look at it that way? Is that the way it is?
To some extent. We look at it because to us, Islam is so foreign to us that the different delineations between Islam are somewhat incomprehensible to most Americans.
So why even use them?
It makes it seem more foreign and more separate from what we can deal with.
Okay, all right, why else?
Perhaps because some of the government-held areas were predominantly, or had a larger population of one, or had supported, there were some areas that got a lot of press that supported the government or the opposition, or those were areas that were taken over by them. But, you know, when you look at it, there's peoples all over the place who are just trying to move and get out of the way. It might be because it's simpler for us to just say, oh, it's between two religious sects. And we were watching the Frontline thing on Syria from last spring. We teach a global relations class.
Oh, yeah.
And we were looking at that in just the one corner. And the kids came away from it with being, it's so much more complex. It's so much more complex. So maybe it's simpler just to say, oh, it's a religious war, when it's not.
Yeah.
I just wonder if students, and I can't speak for so much, but if students see it more as a age thing also, that the news that they're getting is from social media, and that we're learning a lot about this through a lot of cell phone and a lot of just video on cameras, and that's what's coming out, and they don't see it as a religious thing. They see it as young versus an older regime, or oppressed versus revolution, and like, let's go change. So I don't know if Americans, I can't speak for them, I think most people I talk to would probably say it's not necessarily religious, it's about oppression and age.
Okay, all right. I go with it's simpler for Americans to just talk about religious differences. Religion has been used in the conflict as propaganda to gain support. So the government, or the president of Syria, not the whole government, the president of Syria and his closest allies are Alawites, Shia. And so they actually started the use of religious rhetoric to gain supporters. They started telling Christians and, well, everybody else in Syria, oh my gosh, the opposition, they're coming from outside, they're outside agitators, and they are Wahhabis, or Al-Qaeda types. So Christians, you know, have by and large, not completely, kept their heads down, but would lean towards maintaining the present regime. The religious Sunni opposition have also used religion to gain followers, simply by saying these Alawites, they're not Muslim, they're idolaters. We have to restore proper practice of religion to our country. So both sides have used religion as propaganda. However, in my mind, it is not a religious civil war, even if religion is involved as a motivating factor.
So can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
So,
Sorry.
in which of those, I'm just trying to think how to say it without sounding absolutely stupid, but in would we say that there's a mix of jihadists then in both factions, or in all of these factions?
No, the jihadists are only on the opposition side.
But, so mostly among Sunnis then?
Yes. Yeah.
So because I've always, in Muslims, always believed that the majority of Muslims are not radical conservative jihadists.
Right.
But the majority of Muslims are Sunnis, are they not?
Yes, they are. Yeah, but it's
So
out
that's-
of Sunnism that these jihadi groups, these extreme Sunni groups, have arisen. And in part, that's because of the influence of Saudi Arabia and of Wahhabism. Because Saudi Arabia has a lot of dough, and since the 1970s, it has been using foreign aid in the surrounding and outlying Islamic countries to support these religious groups.
So, is the contradiction or tension that in an effort to defeat an oppressive government, a more oppressive organization is part of the oppositions, and so here we are, like, particularly if you're a woman, right, and you're, obviously you want a society that's democratic, and at the same time, you have a group like the jihadis fighting for the democratic society, but then what kind of society is actually going to be implemented?
Well, I wouldn't, well, jihadis may be arguing for a democratic society, I sort of doubt it. They are.
Don't they want Sharia, aren't they proposing Sharia law being
They
imposed?
would want a more Islamic state, based more on Islamic practice.
So fueling the revolution then is the passion or fuel behind the revolution is changing or evolve. I mean, it initially started with the oppression and now it's evolving into something else.
Right. If you originally joined the opposition as an opposition to authoritarian rule, you got nothing to choose from now. Either opposition or the regime as is.
How demoralizing.
Oh, and I would say
There's no
the
hope.
main feeling in Syria right now is not, oh, we want democracy. It's
They want the war.
stop.
Stop the
Just
fighting.
stop. We want it to stop. The conditions in Syria are horrible. It's winter now. You think of the Middle East as warm? No, it's snowing in Syria now.
Plus they've had that outbreak of polio.
There's outbreak of polio, there's very little food, there have been deaths from hunger, which is just unbelievable for Syria. Syrians can't believe the extent of the tactics used by both sides to starve areas taken by the opposite side. This is a map showing roughly where fighting stands up until, well, I can't keep up to the exact moments, but basically it's a stalemate. It has been a stalemate for at least the last year. The north is a rebel-held area, largely rebel-held. Why? Turkey, the help is coming down through Turkey. Yeah, absolutely. This area is solidly pro-regime. This is the Alawite area of the country. You know, not all Alawites support the regime. We think they do, but not all do. Alawites, like everybody else has lived under the abuses of this government and don't like it. Alawites have not fared better than other religious groups under this
And the ruling
government
party is
since
Alawite?
1970. Excuse
And
me?
the ruling party is Alawite in Syria?
No,
and
the
they're not-
ruling party is a mixture of Sunnis, Alawites. The ruling party is the Ba'ath Party. Ba'ath Party is a secular party, and people from all religions are part of it. Yes?
Was Syria, prior to this, uprising after the election, was not Syria secular as a society?
Very much so.
Women, just like Iraq was before
Very
we
much
blew it
so.
up.
The Middle East, since the 1970s, has, at least measured in terms of women's clothing, has become more Islamic. A lot of this has to do with support for religious welfare groups from Saudi Arabia, and some of it has to do with the failure of the secular states to provide for their people, to do anything for the Palestinians. And so people have looked for another answer, and some have come up with the answer that Islam is the answer. So, for example, I first went to Syria in 1970. I did not see one veiled woman, not one. Last time I was in Syria was in 2006. There were a lot of veiled women on the streets. Not the Saudi, well, some were Saudi-type veiling, black and head to foot. But some, you know, in short, knee-length skirts, black stockings, and a black scarf over their heads, over their faces, just thrown over their faces and heads. I never saw that in 1970. So for what it's worth. Another way that Syria is central to the Middle East is its relation to troubles in other countries. Syria has always been a recipient of refugees. The Armenians during the massacres in the First World War, those who survived came to Syria, largely to the city of Aleppo, but also to Damascus, also to Beirut, some to Jerusalem. Assyrians, Chaldeans, they are a Christian group in Iraq in 1933 because they were associated with the British Army. Once Iraq became independent in 1932, Iraqis turned against this Christian population because of its association with the old regime. Palestinians, refugees from Israel came in 1948 and thereafter. Lebanese during the Lebanese Civil War. You know, I got the wrong date there. It's 1975 to 1990. 15 years. Lebanese were going back and forth across the border as the situation and wherever they lived changed. And Iraqis, a huge number of Iraqis was in Syria the last time I was there. Syria today is the creator of refugees, some 2.5 million in total. 1.2 million have gone outside the country, primarily to the surrounding countries, and 1.3 million are not in their homes inside the country. They have had to move away from places where fighting is going on. Most Syrians, like most of us, I suppose, are unarmed. You know, what are you going to do when fighting breaks up? You're going to seek shelter somewhere else. Yes? Yeah, okay. So, maybe this is a picture from the I imagine the 1950s. You know, American culture is loved in the Middle East, is admired in the Middle East. It's the minority of people who, you know, are like that concerning the West, concerning America, or at least American culture and Americans. What is at issue is American policy. And Middle Easterners see American policy as not in their interests. America has supported all of the worst dictatorships of the region. America supports Israel. It is not that the surrounding region is anti-Semitic. It is that Israel kicked out Palestinians and did not allow them to return. And there has been no settlement for the Palestinians since 1948. Granted, some of them have settled in surrounding countries, some of them have gone to Europe, some of them have come here. Some of them are still in refugee camps in the Middle East. No passports, they can't move, they can't travel, they don't have access to state schools. They don't have access to jobs necessarily. Syria has treated them fairly well. They are not citizens of Syria. They do not carry Syrian passports, but they do have access to state schools and they do have access to jobs. So, to my mind, the United States has blown its influence in the Middle East. In particular, since the American invasion of Iraq. 2003. What's happened to Iraq since then? Is Iraq our close ally? Hardly. Afghanistan, we're still in Afghanistan, Pakistan. Those places have really turned against us, where once upon a time they were not. Egypt, it's anybody's guess what's going to happen in Egypt. The Arabian Peninsula, for better or worse, is still an American ally. All the countries of the Arabian Peninsula, not necessarily countries that we would want to be associated with. Saudi Arabia in particular. Finally, just to support the notion that youth is important in this, basic facts. Median age 23. Actually, it's 22.7. I rounded it up. Unemployment, 20% is certainly a lower figure than actual.
This is just Syria, or is this?
This is
all-
just
okay.
Syria, just Syria.
How does the literacy rate compare to other Middle Eastern countries?
Iraq is worse because of the years of war in Iraq. Until 1990, Iraq had a very high rate of literacy. Lebanon is better.
Iran?
Iran is better. Iran is better.
Saudi
What else?
Arabia?
Saudi Arabia is probably better. I don't know for certain. The Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, for example, is extremely high. Qatar is extremely high because they have the money to pour into their school systems and have done so with wild abandon in the last 10 to 20 years. Throughout the Middle East, there are more women university students than men. Surprise, surprise. Yes?
I'm curious about median age 23. That seems awfully young.
Oh, yeah.
Is it because of the Civil War or other factors?
Other factors. Now you want me to say what are the other factors? I don't know. There is a high birth rate. I think the more insecurity of life there is, the higher the birth rate. I can tell you that the median age of the Gaza Strip is something like 18 or 19. But finally, I don't know.
If the women are becoming more confined and it's becoming more conservative, then kind of all they're doing right now is making more kids.
Well, that's possibly true, but then on the other hand, more women are going to universities, which is...
Those are the 23 and 24-year-olds, like their mothers didn't have that opportunity.
No, that's true. That's true. That's true to a degree. Well, the Palestinians have a joke that explains their high birth rate, at least in the occupied territories, because they are frequently under curfew. And they have to stay at home. Okay, I don't have to finish. I don't have to finish that joke.
Nothing else to do. Kind of like when we have blizzards.
So, that's it.
Thank you.